The study of history is not just the study of the past, it's an explanation of the present. The Chief spoke about the tendency for contraction and neglect of the Australian Army during peacetime. I'd like to go a little further and look at the Army's neglect of itself, particularly its neglect of the profession. There are many things within the Army's control that rely very little on government investment and defence policy making, and these things, if neglected, cost time and lives too. Examples of these kinds of things include training, discipline, the process by which recruits are enculturated, the physical conditioning of troops for war, their mental conditioning, their spiritual conditioning, the Army's tactical competence, its field discipline, its doctrine, the rate and form of its adaptation, the quality of its leaders, its readiness for battle. But most importantly, its professional education in the subjects of war, warfare, and the performance of armies at war. While you might argue that some of the matters I listed are relatively technical affairs, which is true, I contend the quality or features of each is utterly dependent on the Army's relative understanding of the bigger questions of war and warfare. Things like what is war's nature, what affects the conduct of war, how does technology affect war, how does social change affect war, what makes people fight, what makes a good fighting force, what are the features of good civil-military relations, how does war relate to war aims and policy, how do you win wars, and that kind of thing. My thesis is that, notwithstanding the national tendency for contraction and neglect in peace, the Army's neglect of its institutional foundations, particularly its professional education, weaken it markedly. I assert in particular it is the Army's neglect of the study of the history of war and warfare that is at the heart of the problem. My aim is not to solve the problem today, but to merely set up the conference by pointing to the symptoms and perhaps some of the causes of neglecting to study the history of war and warfare. I hope it will serve as a useful reference point for the discussion that I know will follow. I'm going to use the Army's use of language as the canary in the coal mine, so to speak. In the process, I'll also reflect on our recent wartime performance and our contemporary thinking about war. As I said, my aim is to use these things to give an indication of the state of the profession in the Australian Army, and I think the way we speak to ourselves hints at something rotten at the professional core. So let's start with the idea we've never met an adjective or adverb that we didn't like. We don't just exploit things in the Army, we fully exploit them. We don't just integrate things, we seamlessly integrate them. We don't just review things, we holistically review them. According to a recent Army document, the world isn't just a dangerous place, it's a complex and challenging strategic environment. We don't talk about problems, we have challenges and issues to meet, face and overcome. We speak with unnecessary jargon and gibberish. Take this sentence from an Army report. Decision superiority through the provision of those support tools that generate rapid information exchanges in order to support near-instant decision speed is a critical enabler. Now, I have no clue what that means, and I'm almost certain that neither do you. And what does the following mean? The land force generates access, influence, control, positional advantage and decision superiority in order to contribute to the integrated force in support of a strategy of denial. Now, even if we think we know what things like decision superiority actually mean, this sentence could be referring to an advertising agency, a Department of State, perhaps an intelligence agency, or any other number of organisations. It gives no sense that it's talking about an army, nor that violence is the principal means that makes an army a necessary and useful instrument of state policy. Perhaps these statements share their origins with the words of a senior American officer during the Afghanistan war. He told a bewildered group of journalists that time-sensitive targets were deconflicted in minutes using theatre-wide joint fires coordination information systems. I suspect he was trying his best to avoid saying, "We discovered an insurgent who we were looking for, made sure that innocent people weren't too close to him, and ordered a fighter pilot to drop a bomb on him. While not an Australian example, it's still illustrative. It epitomises how Western militaries, including ours, have allowed modern managerial and advertising logic and doublespeak to pollute the profession. So why does it matter? During an amphibious exercise I led as a commanding officer, a young Special Forces liaison officer tried to explain to me what Special Forces were doing prior to an amphibious assault. He gave me a long-winded monologue about disproportionate strategic effects, strategic ISR, national reachback, direct action, time-sensitive targets, strategic leveraging, weapons overmatch. I inquired as to what the hell he meant. I suggested, so you mean that you have a patrol in those 2 grid squares there who are looking for a missile launcher, and when they find it, they're going to call in an airstrike. And my simple language must have confirmed in his mind that I was some kind of half-witted ignoramus who clearly didn't get modern warfare. In his response, he tried to educate me by saying, so you don't need to worry about how we do it, you only need to concern yourself with the effect that we are achieving. Now, I disagreed strongly. Context and specifics matter. And if only I had the presence of mind to relate to him the story of the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. Some of you might be familiar, but statistician Edward Tufte has demonstrated that the use of bullet points and managerial speak caused important engineering details to be buried in a crowded PowerPoint slide on which the senior NASA decision makers would make the final decision to launch. By the time the PowerPoint slides made their way up through to the senior decision makers at NASA, the probability and consequence of a tile falling off the shuttle's fuselage had washed out. It became a sub-bullet on one small slide in a pack of dozens. In other words, had I accepted the gobbledygook of the young Special Forces officer, I too might have inadvertently put patrols at risk of shooting each other up for some abstract notion that I should only be interested in the so-called effect rather than the particulars of its execution. War and warfare are not just abstract things. Just ask the Israeli commanders during the 2006 war in Lebanon, and many of you might recall that at the time the Israeli Defence Force had succumbed to the cult of postmodernism thanks to General Shimon Nave. The resulting vague and abstract orders were a major contributing factor to the IDF's poor performance in the war. So where does this tendency to use contrived, non-specific and misleading language come from? Well, I think this is the point. Putting aside the unavoidable creep of managerial speak and postmodernism into everyday language, in the Australian Army's case, I think it derives from ignorance which manifests as a form of hubris. I think it's sort of like the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is, as you know, the bias inherent in people with a low ability in a specific field or discipline that causes them to overestimate their competence precisely because they lack the expertise to recognise how little they know or how poor they are at something. And I think in this case, the Australian Officer Corps on the whole, has had this problem for decades, making it particularly vulnerable to these social trends. I think the Officer Corps' knowledge of warfare and what makes armies tick is abject, which manifests in part, or at least causes an unquestioning acceptance of things like managerial language and postmodern abstract thinking. It also manifests as nonsensical and theoretically implausible concepts like decision superiority and information dominance. They treat the human brain as though it's a computer and it treats decision-making like an engineering problem. It also manifests as banal terms like intelligence-led operations, as though the imbeciles who fought wars before our generation just did random stuff without the aid of intelligence. So take, for example, the banality of the following two ideas I found in an Army report on future warfare. The first one reads, "The application of rapid overmatching power at decisive points, whether kinetic or non-kinetic in their composition, is likewise crucial." I think Nathan Bedford Forrest captured the idea in just 6 words 150 years ago with the maxim, "Get there fastest with the mostest." The second example is an even more extraordinary case of banality, and it goes, "As long as land warfare requires the delivery of lethal effects to achieve military objectives, the weapon systems which deliver them remain fundamental to the way battles are fought." Now, if you pull that apart, that's an absurdly elaborate way of saying as long as war is violent, it's a good thing to have weapons. But perhaps it's not so banal to someone who has grown up entirely ignorant of the idea that war's essence is violence. There's a whole school of thinking in the army and more broadly that war is about influence. To someone with no foundation in the study of war, war's nature is elusive. Without a foundation in Clausewitz, for example, it's easy to make absurd claims like we are already at war in cyberspace. Now, many officers are unable to put their experiences and thoughts into perspective when their knowledge of their profession is limited to contemporary technical matters like tactics, targeting processes, weapon effects, fire support coordination measures, administration, and that kind of thing. Those things are important, but they are to the profession of arms as bricklaying or joinery are to architecture, or as courtroom procedure is to law, or as surgery is to medicine. Surgery is important, of course, but it is reckless without an understanding of the human body, its systems and its responses to certain stimuli. For example, for an officer with a shallow knowledge of military history, everything seems novel or significant. We see this symptom in the way we create new terms for age-old things. For example, the hyperbole in terms used during the Afghanistan war. We use terms like complex ambush and complex attack to describe some farmers using some homemade explosives, some rusty old weapons, and that kind of thing to attack us. If an attack using some RPGs, homemade bombs and small arms is a complex attack, then what the hell was D-Day? The absence of historical context invites presentism bias, and we can see these trends come together in our usage of verbs. Take the use of the verb provide. Armies don't provide, they fight. They kill, they destroy, they defend, they attack. Insurance companies provide, doctors provide, mothers and fathers provide. Delivery is another grossly overused term. We don't deliver effects. We seek out, close with, kill, capture, seize, and hold and repel attacks. The postman delivers and the florist delivers. It's important because the abstraction of our language disconnects us from the realities of what the army does. For example, delivering effects conjures up images of neat warfare in which packages of destruction are politely delivered to compliant and passive targets. Warfare is, of course, a matter of its time. Its form is contingent on many things, including contemporary social and cultural influences. Unexpected and unknowable future circumstances must cause future warfare to be different to what it is today. But it will be violent, that is for certain. Yet narratives and theories of the last few decades would lead many young officers and soldiers to conclude that convincing an enemy or a public of the righteousness of our cause is more in keeping with war's logic than compelling an enemy to submit to our will through force of arms. The so-called Coindonistas who held sway over thinking about war and warfare here and elsewhere for at least a decade caused many officers to believe that benevolence, dominant narratives, information campaigns, persuasion, or the dispersion of largesse are the first means of war. with violence being a nasty side effect or something to be avoided. We convinced ourselves you can't kill your way to victory in war, but of course you can. Just ask the Taliban. Such is the logic of violence in war. Victory in war is, after all, not only a means to an objective of policy, not the end in itself. War at its heart is a deliberate choice to use violence for an end of policy. Without violence, there is no war. War is, by definition, an act of killing and destruction. The intractable connection between violence and war is the thing that gives war its potential utility as a means of policy, but also its limitations and its risks. I suspect that forgetting war's violent essence is what leads governments into the indecisive circumstances often described by the term quagmire, which was, of course, the motivation for the post-Vietnam Weinberger and Powell doctrines. Violence gives war a strange logic. It led Clausewitz, of course, to say that mistakes that come from kindness are the worst kind in war. So take, for example, Abraham Lincoln's approach to the American Civil War. In 1864 and 65, he oversaw Sherman's march to the sea, which laid waste to Georgia's war-making resources. He endorsed Grant's attrition of Lee's army in Virginia. Lincoln, of course, was not a violent man, but by 1863 he had come to understand the logic of war, which is a logic of violence. He chose to maximise violence rather than minimise it, and he brought the war to a decisive and lasting end. I suspect that if we had the opportunity to ask Americans or Britons at the beginning of the Second World War whether their bombers would soon be laying waste to entire cities and killing hundreds of thousands of their enemy's civil population, they would answer that they would not do so. It was not in their nature. Within a few years, incendiary bombs would destroy scores of German and Japanese cities, and 2 atomic bombs would lay waste to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In these examples, we see that war is not only subject to the influence of social factors, war also has a nasty habit of changing societies themselves. That, of course, is the main point of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian Wars. Such is the nature of violence and such is the nature of war. But we are at risk of believing these examples to be strange excesses of bygone ages rather than essential representations of war. I'm not convinced the Australian Army understands, even at a base level, war's violent nature, let alone the implications of that fact. I think this ignorance is not a new phenomenon. I think it's a decades-long thing and its consequences are very real and very serious. One consequence is treating war as a place in which death and having to kill are akin to workplace hazards rather than the purpose or essence of war itself. Since the early 2000s, the government gives allowances to Australian troops at war based on the logic of exposure to hazards. The condition for the award of the new Operation Service Medal, which replaced the Australian Service and Active Service medals, is an assessment of the degree of hazard. To treat killing and dying in war as an incidental workplace hazard has potentially profound implications for how you go about those things. It's a subject worthy of its own address, but let me provide you with one small example to illustrate the point. Some of you might have heard me speak about the order of the day our commanding officer issued to us the day we arrived at Kigali in Rwanda 30 years ago. The order included 10 bullet points, and point number 10 was, there is nothing here worth dying for. In April 1995, just a few months later, as the massacre of up to 8,000 people at the Kabayo displaced persons camp began to unfold, the contingent commander ordered the on-scene infantry commander, Steve Tilbrook, not to fire to save the lives of the innocent. The young infantryman protected the Australian medics and doctors, sometimes at the point of a bayonet and sometimes from the desperate displaced people themselves, but they did not fire to protect the women and children for whom the whole United Nations mission was there for. The Rwandan Patriotic Army soldiers executed women and children in front of our troops, and they taunted them, smiling as they did so. The argument then and now is that, of course, they would have likely have died if they fired to protect the innocent. But isn't that precisely the point? Isn't that what soldiers and armies do? Needless to say, most of the soldiers who witnessed the massacre suffer terribly to this day. I think these things happen when armies lose their integrity, and I contend that loss of integrity is made all the more likely without the anchor of historical perspective. Now, I'm sure many of you are also aware of the controversy surrounding a post-operation report I wrote at the end of my tour in Afghanistan in 2012. My observations related to quite serious poor performance by our forces in Afghanistan. I suggested it was the result of a systemic failure of command over many years. Although widely misinterpreted, my report was a criticism of my generation and recent generations of commanding officers and senior officers. It was effectively stating, look at what we have allowed the Army to become. So take this one example. In late March 2011, I received a visit from Colonel Dick Parker. Dick had just returned from Afghanistan, having completed an inquiry into the death of Sapper Larkham. We were just a couple of months from deploying to Afghanistan. Now, Sapper Larkham, as you might recall, died of a gunshot wound received in the Charmiston area on the 21st of February 2011. Dick was so incensed by what he'd found during his inquiry that he sought permission from the CDF to make his findings known to the soldiers of the 2RAR battle group. The CDF only gave him permission to speak to the RSM and me. Now, Dick showed me a video taken by soldiers in the days and hours leading up to Sapper Larkham's death. Some of the video showed the patrol in overwatch positions within small arms range of the valley floor in what could only be described as a holiday atmosphere and a picnic tactical layout. Soldiers and NCOs were sitting in picnic chairs. They were facing in. Soldiers were standing around in tight groups. They were in varying states of mixed dress. Weapons weren't carried. Armour wasn't worn. Loud music was playing. And all this was occurring in an area that the task force was operating in for the first time and was believed to be a Taliban safe area. Contact was expected. Dick then showed me photos taken minutes before Sapper Larkham was shot. The last photo taken was a photo of about 10 men, most of the patrol standing shoulder to shoulder in a line. They were watching another soldier attempting to dig a boulder out of the ground because the soldiers thought that it would be fun to see it roll down the hill. The soldiers were standing about 20 to 30 metres outside the perimeter of the position, without armour or helmets, without weapons. There was only one sentry. He was facing the valley floor. Minutes later, the Taliban opened fire from roughly 600 metres away with a PKM from a spur in the dasht adjacent to the valley. Sapper Larkham and an interpreter, I think standing at the left of the line, was shot in the chest. What incensed Dick the most was the sense from the patrol members that there was nothing untoward about their behaviour, nor untoward about their field discipline prior to the attack. There was no sense of embarrassment or responsibility for his death. Soldiers showed Dick the videos from their phones without any inhibition. The sense Dick got was that the behaviour of the patrol at the time of the incident was normal drills, normal behaviour, the normal condition and attitude. And this moment confirmed what I'd been feeling for some time, that the Army had grown horribly complacent. After all, the circumstances of Sapper Larkham's death were not unusual. The pattern of poor field discipline and the conduct for Australian patrols in Afghanistan had been well and truly established before that particular tour. And I asserted at the time that there were two main points of systemic weakness: a general failure of moral courage and a loss of historical perspective. And I contended that they were closely related. I argued if we praise and reward that which is mediocre, we set the benchmark at mediocre. If we hyperbolise too much, if, say, for example, that a fairly basic 20th century guerrilla ambush by a few farmers is a complex attack, then we give the impression that a simple tactic that is historically quite common demands special soldiers to do special things to deal with it. If we embellish quite banal ideas with slogans, such as calling the idea that it makes sense to know as much about the enemy as possible before you act, and we call this intelligence-led operations, then we give ourselves a sense that our circumstances are far more challenging than those faced by previous generations, and that we have nothing to learn from them, or that our methods are more sophisticated. If we refer to minor engagements as battles, we diminish our sense of scale and perspective. If we boast about how contemporary warfare is so much more complex or challenging in comparison to wars past, a contention with little evidence to support it, then hubris overcomes humility. And if we pander to our soldiers every want, they develop a sense of entitlement which leads to unmet expectation and resentment. In other words, our hyperbolising, hollow rhetoric, flattery, unwarranted praise and pandering at the time was the weak substitute for moral courage. Take, for example, an exchange I had with one of my engineer section commanders who'd done a previous tour of Afghanistan. He complained, with no sense of embarrassment, that 2 days rest between a 3 to 5 day patrol is insufficient. The kind of patrols he was referring to was going forward of the main patrol base by vehicle to a smaller forward patrol base to perhaps do some short daylight patrols with troops of the Afghan army and then return a few days later. I pointed out to him that the average patrol length in Malaya was 21 days and didn't include nightly respite in an Afghan patrol base. More often than not, it involved ambushing. Such is the absence of historical perspective and the consequences of the combination of weak leadership. Now, before we finish, and just to emphasise the far-reaching consequences when armed forces lose touch with the nature of the thing they exist for, war, I think it's worth looking at contemporary writing and thinking about command and control. In short, there is a technical logic underwriting the thinking that has led to the conclusion the most senior theatre headquarters must arrange and execute certain minor tactical engagements, like engagements to sink ships. I shouldn't need to point out the folly of that kind of highly centralised approach to warfare, but it's already taken root because we've forgotten or can't imagine the great frictions of war and warfare, the kind of thing that Clausewitz goes at pains to stress to those who are trying to get an understanding of war. We imagine, as many have in the past and proven wrong, that technology will overcome the fog of war, and we do so despite eons of experience telling us otherwise. All right, so the point of all that is to reinforce what Clausewitz said all those years ago. The study of history is essential. For those with no experience of war or those with a narrow experience of war, the only thing to do is to draw on the thousands of years of vicarious experience of others or remain ignorant. So what are we doing about it? Well, in short, we've made the study of war and warfare and armies mandatory. Earlier this year, the Chief issued a study guide based on a reading list produced by Jeff Gray back in 2012. It mandates the reading of particular texts depending on one's rank and experience. It includes suggestions, of course, for further and extended reading. It amounts to about a minimum of 4 books a year through a career, which ain't that much for a professional, as I think that many of you would recognise. It directs commanding officers to ensure non-commissioned officers and officers are doing the reading by holding professional education sessions to discuss the texts and topics and wrestle with them. The second and probably more profound initiative is the introduction of a new Bachelor of War Studies degree at ADFA in 2027, which is the Chief's initiative. It will be a double major in war studies and the philosophy of war. The vast majority of about 75% of Army officer cadets will complete this degree, setting up what I think is an unprecedented foundation for the profession in Australia. But of course, we ought to do more, and this conference is one of the means to do so. After all, as I began, history isn't just the study of the past, it's an explanation of the present. Thank you.